this video, we're going to look at how to summarize categorical variables using SAS. Before we get started, there's 3 files that you're going to want to make sure you have from Canvas. The first one is going to be the Module 6 SAS code. The second one is going to be the BRFSS dataset. And then the third one is going to be the codebook. And so you saw the codebook back in Module 4, but just as a reminder, this is what the codebook looks like. All right, so the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to read the dataset into SAS. Now, as a warning, the dataset is really big. So the initial dataset that you're going to read in has the data for all of the states. So what we're going to start by doing is we're going to take that big dataset and we're going to make a smaller dataset. Now, in all of the videos where we work with the dataset, I'm going to work with the state of Kentucky. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my big dataset and I'm going to make a smaller one that just has the data for Kentucky and the year 2018, because we're analyzing the 2018 year data for this course. Now for you, when you start working with your data, you're going to do the exact same thing, except you're going to make a smaller data set that has data just for your state. And I'm going to show you how to do that. Now again, the BRFSS dataset that's on Canvas, it's a really big file. Please do not try to open that in Excel first or any other program. You are going to want to read it directly into SAS. And again, this is because this is a really big dataset. All right, so the first thing I have here in the code is a procimport statement to read in that data. So just a couple things to notice here. First, notice that I have my working directory. In other words, I have the path on my computer where this data set is stored. So you're going to want to change this piece of information here to reflect where the file is stored on your computer. The other thing is up here in the out statement. You probably noticed in previous videos, the way that the out statement is formatted is usually you have work, dot, and then the name of the data set. Work, what that stands for is there's a library in SAS that is called work. It's the default library where if you're doing something, it gets stored. That's kind of on the back end of SAS. We're not going to worry about that too much for this class, but if you do take a course in SAS programming, they'll talk more about that. But that's why you always see that work there. It's essentially telling SAS within SAS where to store the data set. And these other things, data row equals 2, that's just saying that the actual data starts on row 2. Row 1 has the variable names. Gitnames is telling it to get the names. And then this CVS replace, that is just saying if the CVS already existed, go ahead and replace it. So we just want to keep that in there. All right, so I'm going to run this. It's going to take it just a minute to run. Alright, so you'll wait for that to finish. You should see on your computer when this runs, you should see this little line here telling you that you had 437,436 observations for 275 variables. So again, big data set. So the first thing we're going to want to do is this data set currently has all of the states in it. So I'm going to make a smaller data set with just the state of Kentucky and the year 2018. You'll want to do the same thing, but you'll want to do this for your data set, or for your state. So to see how we do that, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to bring that code book over and we're going to look at the code book. So I'm going to go to the very first variable, and you'll notice that for each of the variables in the code book, there actually is a line that says SAS variable name. So underscore state is the variable name that gives the state that the observation is from. And if you scroll down, you'll notice that for each of the states were coded in as different numeric values. So for example, the state of Kentucky was coded as 21. All right, so keeping that in mind, let's go back over to the SAS code. So the next piece of SAS code is going to create a new data set with only Kentucky data from 2018. To do this, we're going to run a DataStep. So the first thing I'm going to do is tell SAS what I want the name of the data set to be. So I'm going to call it Kentucky underscore 2018 underscore BRFSS. You'll want to write a name for your state that makes sense. So for example, if you have Florida, you might want to put the abbreviation of Florida here. The next line of code, what it does is it says, okay, we're creating this new data set. It's Kentucky 2018 BRFSS, and I need to start with some data. So I'm going to start with that full BRFSS data set. Then the next line does the following. It says if the variable underscore state, NE stands for not equal to, is not equal to 21, then I want you to delete it from the set. So we start with the full data set and then we remove everything that is not Kentucky. So for your state, you'll want to change this 21 to correspond with the number that goes with your state. And then again, for this course, we're analyzing the data for 2018. So the next thing we're going to do is if I-year. So I-year is another variable. And so if we scroll down, you'll notice that we've got an F month, we've got an I date, I month, I day, and if we keep on going, we find I year. So we can see I year takes the values 2018 and 2019, but we only want the 2018 data. So again, what this line of code is doing is it's saying if year is not equal to 2018, in other words, if it's any year other than 2018, then I want you to delete it. And so by running this, we'll get a data set that just has Kentucky data for the year 2018. Now, some of the groups may want to subset their data even further. So for example, if you're looking at women's health issues, you may want to only have women in your data set. And you can do that by just adding on another line here, and you'll do the exact same thing. You'll want to say if find the variable that corresponds to gender, not equal to, and then depending on if you're looking at males or females, you would put that here. You could do the same thing if you were focusing on a particular race, or however it is that you formulate your research questions, you can subset this any further. Some groups won't need to do this, some groups will. So if you have questions about that, just let me know. All right, so now we're going to run this. And for the Kentucky data, you should have 6,604 observations, and again, 275 variables. Now, a warning here. Everyone, no matter what state you have, it is going to list 275 variables. This is the total number of potential variables, including the core, as well as those optional modules that states have. So the way that this data set is structured, since it started with the data for all of the states, it's going to have a column for each of those variables. If your state did not ask some of those optional modules, then for some of these variables, you're just going to have missing data. And that's perfectly fine. Just remember, you can't analyze any of the variables that your state didn't ask those corresponding questions. Now, we always want to do a couple data checks here. I will warn you, you can run the proc print data and print the entire data set. It's a really big data set. Depending on how fast your computer is, it may or may not run. So proc print if you want to, but just be aware it may make SAS crash. The other thing we can do, which is actually probably more useful, is to use what's called proc contents. And what proc contents is going to do is it's just going to summarize the different variables for us. So we'll get an idea of what these 275 variables look like. So notice I'm saying data equals, and I'm giving the name of our data set, and then you're going to put this var num option afterwards so we get all those variables. So let's run this. All right, so now notice we have variables in creation order, and here are all 275 variables that are in this data set. Now what you're going to notice is some of them are going to be numeric. All of the data from the BRFSS is coded as numbers when it's put in, when the data is entered. So if you see numbers, that's good. If you start seeing things like these characters, and notice it looks kind of funny after it, for the state of Kentucky, these are actually the missing ones. So these correspond with those optional modules that Kentucky didn't ask. So anywhere that you see these, and it'll vary from state to state, that's one way to say, okay, these are missing. I need to remember that. I can't actually analyze those variables for my data set. All right, now the very last thing we're going to do. We've made this nice smaller data set, in this case, Kentucky 2018. Let's save that data set so we never have to do this step again. And so we're going to do that using proc export. So what it's doing is it's saying, okay, take that data set that we just created, out file, this is where you're going to tell SAS, this is where I want you to save this file on my computer. So the only thing you'll need to change for yours is, again, you'll want to change the file path to tell SAS where you want to save this data set, and then the name of the data set. So this name and this name don't have to be the same, but I usually make them the same just for me to remember. And so again, you won't have Kentucky when you work with your data, you'll have another data or state abbreviation there. And then these other options are just there so we make sure everything gets created correctly, so you will have those exact same things. And you will run this. Make sure always to check your log. Looks like everything went good. And so now, if you go to that folder on your computer, you're going to see a new CSV that just has the data for your state. And so in future videos, what you're going to see is when I read in the data, I'm just going to read in that file that I just created. I'm not going to go through these steps again. If you find yourself each and every time you're analyzing data for this course going through these steps, you don't want to do that. Contact me and I'll walk you through it, show you where this file is saved. But we only do this step one time and we never have to do it again because we've created a new data set that we're going to use each and every time. All right, so now that we've made that smaller data set that's much more manageable, that's just for our state, I'm going to show you how to create some of those summaries of categorical variables that we've talked about in the course. The first thing we're going to look at is how to create frequency tables, and we're going to do this using the proc-freq procedure. So the freq, F-R-E-Q, stands for frequency. So I'm going to give it my data set, and then the only option I'm going to put in here is table, and then the name of the variable that I want to summarize. So let's talk a little bit about how to find variables and variable names. All right, so I'm going to go back to the code book here. This code book, it's 154 pages long. It is really hard to navigate, so I'm going to give you a couple pointers here. If you're looking at the code book and on your computer, if you click on the file first, so make sure it's active, and click on Control, hold down to the Control key, and click on F. It's going to bring up a Find option in the PDF. If you're on a Mac, I believe it is Command F will do the same thing. So what you can do now is you can search for words in this document. And so for example, if I knew that I wanted to look for education, and my computer's being a little bit slow here, I can find the matches for education and it will go to directly in this PDF where it finds the word education. And so this could help me find potential variables of things that I'm looking for. Now be careful because it's only going to find things exactly how you spell it or exactly how you word it. So this isn't a foolproof method, but this is a way to help you navigate the PDF. So notice we've got this variable here, it's education level. And notice if we look at the SAS variable name, it's EDUCA. So notice this is a categorical variable. It's what is the highest grade or year of school you completed. Here are the different values that that variable has. And remember that all of the values are going to be coded as numbers in the actual data set. So for example, if this variable takes the value 1, this corresponds to that observation, never attended school or only kindergarten. All right, so what we're going to look at is we're going to summarize this categorical variable. All right, so let's run this. Now notice here I've got this in lowercase. For the most part, SAS is not case sensitive, so you can capitalize or not capitalize and it'll work the same. But let's run this. All right, and here is the table that SAS produces. So by default, SAS is going to give you 4 pieces of information for the different levels of education. It's going to give you the frequency, which is the same as the count. So in this case, there were 4 people who responded with a 1 in the state of Kentucky. It's going to give you the percentage. So out of the Kentucky data set, about 0.06 of them responded 1. It's also going to give you the cumulative frequency and the cumulative percent. For the most part, with the things you do in this course, cumulative frequency and cumulative percent are not going to be terribly informative. Now this particular variable does have an order to it. So just as a reminder, I'm going to kind of bring this over on my screen. So here we can see what the different values of education represent. And let me actually... That's not going to help us. Okay, so notice that there is an ordering here. So 1 is never attended school or only kindergarten, 2 is grade 1s through 8, 3 is grades 9 through 11. So in some ways, this cumulative frequency does help us in the sense of we know there were 577 responses that corresponded to, and again, going back to my code book here, grade 11 or less. But for many of the categorical variables, those cumulative frequencies or percents are not going to be terribly important. Now, in terms of your EPI reports, the most important values here would actually be the relative frequencies or the percentages. Because what we're really interested in is the percentage of the sample that responds in some way. So when you report these values, the most important ones to report are going to be the percentages. You could do percentages and frequencies, but the percentages are by far the most important, and they're the ones that we really care about. The other thing to note here is that when it comes to putting tables in your report, you don't actually want to format them in SAS. Typically, the tables that are formatted in software don't look that nice. You're much better off to format your tables in Word and make them look nice, and we're mainly going to use the software to get the values. Now, one thing that you might have noticed as we look across here, I had to keep on going back and forth to look at my values and to match them up. So it would be nice if we could go ahead and put the labels here so I had those to look at, and that's what we're going to do next. To do this, we're going to create what is called a format, and we do that using proc format. So for proc format, we're going to write value, so that will stay the same, and the variable that I want to format is education. So this label, you can call it whatever you want, but typically what I do is whatever the variable that I want to create a format for, I'll put the name of that variable and FMT after it, because that just stands for this is the format I'm going to use for the education variable. But again, you can put whatever name you want there. But if you were formatting a different variable, I wouldn't use education format here, I would call it something else. Next, what is going to follow, and be careful, notice there are not semicolons after these until we get to the end. What is going to follow is for each of the values in the data set, I'm going to assign what that value actually stands for. So again, if you look and compare between the code book and here, you'll see I've used some abbreviations, but these numbers do match up. And the other thing to notice, these are in quotations because these are characters, they are words. So after you set those up, you're going to run this. And you're not actually going to get any output from this. All this is doing is saving in SAS this format, educa format, which ties these words with the numbers. So next, to make a frequency table that has those formats, remember we ran this code before, we're going to run the exact same code. The only difference is I'm going to add in this additional line, and the additional line, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the word format, give the name of the variable, and then give the name of the format. And here's a very important piece that not to miss. After the name of the format, you have to put a period. Okay, so I got variable name, name of the format I made, and then a period. If you forget the period, this will not work. So that's an important piece to remember. And then this title and title after it, you don't have to do that. I just put that in there to show you. This is going to title the actual output. All right, so let's run this whole thing. And now notice we have the same frequency table we had above, so all the numbers are the same. But now I've got some nice labels here, so I don't have to keep on going back and forth to my code book and accidentally messing something up. So creating these formats are very useful for the frequency tables. We're also going to use them when we go to make bar charts. All right, so let's look and see how to make a bar chart next. So we're going to use what is called proc sgplot. That's what's going to make our bar plots for us. I'm going to give it the name of the data set. I'm going to give my plot a title. So here this is bar chart of education level instead of bar chart, because when somebody looks at this visually, they're going to know it's a bar chart. A lot of times what we'll put instead is distribution of education level. V bar stands for vertical bars. This is going to make vertical bars on my bar chart. A typo there, that'll be fixed on yours. We're going to give it the variable that we're interested in, which is educa. You're going to have a / fill attributes. What that means is how do you want to fill in the bars? And we're going to make, for this particular bar chart, the color red. Okay, so you can put whatever color you want in here. The other things you're not going to change other than the name of the variable. And then if you want a bar chart that the bars go horizontally, you can change V bar to H bar, and I'll do that here in a second to show you. Y and x-axis labels are pretty self-explanatory. They are the Y and the X label, or axis labels rather. So let's run this. And here is our bar chart. And it's a decent looking bar chart. One of the problems here though is notice we've got the numbers down on the bottom. We need to have these labeled because if we put this into our document, we don't want our reader to have to go and figure out what these numbers represent. We need to put those in. So to do that, what we do is we actually use that format line just like we did before. But before I do that, I do want to show you what this looks like if I change this over to H bar instead of V bar. See, now you've got horizontal lines. All right. So next, let's actually label those values along the axis. To do this, the only thing I'm going to add in is that format line just like we did with the frequency table. And notice here with that format line, I have the name of the variable, the name of the format I created, and then I've got that period. Remember, you have to have the period after the format name, otherwise this will not work. And we're going to run this. And notice now we have a much nicer bar plot, but there are still some things that we could do to really make this the quality that we need for your reports. So there's two main things we want to be able to do. The first one is just like when I was talking about with the frequency tables, along that y-axis we don't actually want counts, we want relative frequencies. And the reason for that is we're really interested in the percentage of our sample that responded a certain way. So let's see how we could change this y-axis over to relative frequencies. All right, so in order to do this, we're going to first look at the proc_freq, and what we're going to do is we're going to save the percentages or the relative frequencies from that table. So to do this, I call the proc_freq statement with the data just like I did before. I use the same format as I did before, and then I'm going to table that education variable, but now I've got some extra stuff after it. And this extra stuff, essentially what this is going to do is this is going to output a new variable that saves those percentages, and we're going to need that. So for yours, you won't actually change any of this. The only thing you're going to want to be careful of is this is the name of what is being output. If you're making several bar plots, you don't want to output something by the same name each time because you're going to overwrite it. So instead what I would do is for each variable you work on these, you could do one of two things. Make the first one freq1 out, the next one freq2, freq3, 3, or you could put the name of the variable here. Whatever you want to do, just to denote if you're making multiple bar plots that those are going to be different. Then when you go to make the bar plot, instead of calling your data set, you're going to call what you made here. So whatever you put here, you want it to match here. So next, notice the title is the same before, and let's again, instead of make that bar chart, let's do distribution. I've still got education. I've still got that response piece that we've got here. Notice just like we did before, but now I've added in response equals percents, not just the fill attributes. And then my y and x-axis are similar to before, except now I don't want to have count, I want percentage. And so let's run this. And it looks like I've got an error. Let's see if we can find that. Oh, I think the problem is, let's try this. I think I didn't run this first. So we run that. Oh, there we go. So now, notice I've got a new bar chart. It does look slightly different than the one I had before, but I do now have those percentages here, which is really what I want. All right, so, and again, running this, now we've got it in the red. So the mistake I made there is make sure you run this first, which created that lighter one, and then to get the red one, if you want one that looks different, that was run by this code right here. So again, notice now we've got percentages, we've got the red bars, we've got everything labeled, we've got our nice title here, and in your title, make sure, don't put distribution of the variable name as it's coded in SAS. You do want to have, a nice descriptive name there. All right, last thing we're going to do to fix this bar plot to get it ready for your reports is notice as we look across these different values, notice you've got refused here at the end. Refused really isn't all that informative. So instead, what would be better is let's remove the refused values. Now, if we do that, anytime we remove any data, we want to make a comment about it. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove it, and then underneath your plot and your actual report, you'll make a little note that says there were this many that refused that were removed from the data set. You'll also want to note if there's any missing values. Now, education doesn't have any missing values, but if there were missing values for your variable, you'll want to make sure that you show that. And that would, if we scroll back up here, that will usually appear here with the frequency procedure. You'll see a little note there that says how many missing. It's just we don't have any missing right now for the education variable. All right. So to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to create, a new variable, and that new variable is going to be equal to education, but with no refusals. So we've got here, we're going to start out with our data set. We're going to, again, place our original data back in there. And then this line of code is going to create a new variable. It's going to be called educa education underscore no miss. And really what I'm going to be doing is removing the refusals. So I could, instead of no miss, call this new refusal if I wanted to. Up to you how you'd label that. I'm going to start out by setting the variable equal to the full education variable. Then what I'm going to do is use this line that says if educa is equal to 9, and just as a reminder, going back to our code book, notice that refused is coded as a 9 here. Then I want my new variable, so the new variable I created, to be equal to a period. And so in SAS, a period is missing for missing. So we're setting that to be missing. So let's run this. Now let's use proc contents to see if that variable got added. So if we scroll all the way down to the end, sorry about that. So scrolling here, sorry, my variables got out of order. It's now alphabetic. We don't actually want those listed in alphabetical order, so I'm going to change something here to make it easier to look at. Remember up here at the top when I used that proc contents before, I had that var num. That's going to sort it by variable number. So let's do that just to make it easier to look at. And I'll include this in your code. Now if we run this, notice now they're in order by number. And all the way down here at the end, we have this new variable 276, which is education no miss. And so in other words, this is the education variable with the refusal set to missing. All right, anytime you remove values, you want to make sure you know what values were removed. So in this example, there were 15 people who did not know or we refused to answer. So we'll say refused just to be clear here. And we could get that from our previous frequency table. So now let's rerun our frequency table. And so this was our original data set, so that's where I'm getting that 15 refusals from. And now I'm going to run the exact same thing, except instead of calling the education variable, I'm going to call that new education variable that I just created. And see, now the refused have been removed. And notice here at the bottom it tells me the frequency of missing is 15. Now be careful here, because when you make your notes, When you run the full data set, there's the potential that there were just some missing values that weren't in your original data set. Then when you remove the refusals, it's going to lump the two of them together. So that's why you're going to kind of on a scrap piece of paper or notes off to the side, you would want to note how many original missings there were and how many refusals there were. Because again, when you go to put this plot in your report, you'll want to have a little footer that says there were this many that were missing, there were this many that refused, and so on. And if you need help with that, let me know. All right. The other thing is, notice here for the formatting, I could still use that EDUCA format, and the reason for that is the relationship between the numbers and the values, that part hasn't changed. So since that's still the same, I can still use this format. So now finally, we're going to get our nice bar plot that we want. So this is going to be the bar plot with the refusals. So notice it's the same as what I did before, except now I'm calling that new variable that I made. And running this is a great bar plot to include in your reports. We've got all of the bars labeled. We've got, oh no, we still need frequency over here. We're so close. So what you'll notice is as you make these bar plots, it is going to be this iterative process where you're going to have to constantly go and tweak little things. All right, so let's go back here. Let's get that over to be those relative frequencies that we want, and then we'll be good. So I'm going to use the exact same process I did before. You'll notice here is that proc_freq statement. Notice here I've got a new data set I'm going to output, and just like I was talking about before, since this one is for that new variable I created, I just called it freq2 output because I don't want to override my original one. So now I'm going to call that one. We're going to run all this together. Well, actually, let's run this one first. Remember that one's going to create this bar chart, which is okay, but we know we can make it better using the proc_sg. I'm going to run this one, and now we've got a nice bar plot. So this is what you really want for your reports. You want to have proportions here on the side, a title, your axes labeled, all of our bars now have a label. Those refusals, we've taken them off. We're going to make a note in the footer of our plot how many refusals and how many missing there were. And this looks really good. All right, so the last thing we're going to look at is pie charts. They're very similar to how you made bar charts. It's still going to use a proc statement, but now instead of sgplot, it's going to be gchart. Now, one thing that I will say, I'm going to show you how to make a pie chart for the education variable. Bar charts are really better than pie charts. Pie charts are useful if you just have a few categories to include, so I'll have you make one or two of those. But really, if you have several categories like we do with this education variable, you really want to be using a bar chart. Alright, so here's how we could run the bar chart. Notice I'm going to still be using that format. So these formats are very useful for these categorical variables. Run this, and here's my pie chart I get. It's okay, but notice one of the problems is that some of my labels showed up and some of them didn't. So here's what you can try to do if your labels do not show. Whether or not they show is probably going to be dependent on the variable that you're summarizing. So what we're going to do is create a new variable, and we're going to call it C_education. Basically what this is doing is it's creating a categorical variable equal to education that makes it like the formatting that we saw earlier. So if we run this, and then we run proc contents, and after this I do need to have that var num statement, so that it does it by variable number. We go here all the way to the end. Notice now I've got yet another variable for education, and it is stored as a character, not a number. We could have done this earlier with the bar charts. The problem if you do that is it will put the bar chart in alphabetical order, and it messes with the order of the bar chart. So that's why using the format up above is better. So now we make a pie chart of that C_education. And we can see now all of our labels are on here. And again, this is a decent looking pie chart. They're pretty easy to make. You'll notice under each of the labels it has the count as well as the frequency. So again, not terrible, and probably really instead of title, same with the bar chart, instead of saying the type of chart, since we can visually see that, it's probably better just to say distribution. And then you could also make a 3D pie chart, and that's included down here. I just put this in here for illustration, but that's what this would look like. And same thing as before, we could do this pie chart of the C education, and it would fix that labeling issue. I went through the pie charts pretty quick because, again, I think I only have you all make 1 or 2 of these, and you really only want to be making pie charts if you just have very few options or values that your variable takes. So if you have any questions or problems with the pie charts, let me know, but the ones that you're going to focus on the most are going to be those bar charts. So as always, if you have questions, please let me know. What you're really struggling with here should be what variables to summarize, how you want to summarize those variables, not so much with the code itself. So if you know what you want to summarize, you've put the code together, but you're getting errors, feel free, to post a question or ask me a question about your code, and I can usually go in and fix it pretty quick for you.